Welcome to AI Horizons, a video podcast series where we dive into the topics of AI, trust, and elevating the human potential. Today, we'll focus on the pivotal role of trust in organizations, especially as it relates to implementing new technologies like artificial intelligence in the workplace. Today, we have with us Nancy Gibbs to help us dive into the topic of trust. Nancy, you are a professor of practice and director of the Shorenstein Center for Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. You also were the former editor of Time, the 17th editor at Time magazine, and the first woman to hold that post. You're also credited with Time's digital transformation strategy, and during your leadership, took them from 22 million to 55 million viewers, and within a year, over 60 billion views on online video content. In addition to that, Nancy also has been a presidential historian, having interviewed 5 different presidents over the years. Before we dive into the topic of trust, can you tell us more about just your story, going from Time editor, journalism, to historian, and now to faculty and director at Harvard?
Well, first of all, Kathy, it's really fun to get to talk to you about these really interesting topics right now that are upending newsrooms like the one where I worked and universities like the one where I am now, as well as businesses everywhere. My career was mainly as a storyteller, and I still think of myself principally as a storyteller who just has been exercising those muscles in different arenas. So for most of my career at Time, I was a writer, writing about culture and society and ultimately about politics. When I became an editor, which I did somewhat reluctantly, it was partly because that happened at just the moment that newsrooms everywhere were being upended by new digital technologies that were completely changing the way people consume information, which was an incredible learning curve, but also kind of harrowing. And then when it was time for another change, I was excited to come to Harvard to teach at the School of Government. So I'm not teaching journalism. I'm not teaching journalism students. I'm trying to help leaders understand how to communicate more effectively and understand the forces that have been so rewiring our brains, our consumption patterns, and the information ecology broadly. And so I get to sort of be an eternal student because every single time I teach a class about our information ecosystem, it is in a different place than it was even 6 months ago, and that has never been more true than this year.
I feel the same about the class I teach, where every time we teach, we just learn so much more from the students and interrogating what we know ourselves. And as you know, one of the things I teach about is building technology and its adoption out in the world, in society, in businesses, in governments, et cetera. Can you tell us more about your experience in bringing technology to the newsroom and what that transformation period was like?
So the first week that I started at Time, which was back in like 1985, what happened to be the week that the first computers landed on writers' desks. And a great many of the writers who were very seasoned journalists were absolutely allergic to learning how to work these things. They had their typewriters, they loved their typewriters, they were accustomed to using carbon paper to, type their stories and have multiple copies go off to the fact checkers and the editors. And the idea of shifting their core act of getting ideas out of their heads and into text and into the hands of other people into a totally new machine was harrowing for many of them and infuriating to others. And there were rumors about one who tried to throw his out the window. And so for young people coming in, and this is a dynamic that plays out over and over and over again, the youngsters were like, these are so cool, how do I learn how to work it? And in a way we had a chance to learn to use the machinery first because it would be sitting idle while the senior people ignored it and hoped it would go away. And so I think that was sort of a parable of how new technologies, whether hardware or software, infiltrate established systems. And so I felt, incredibly lucky to have been in the first wave, first of actually being able to write stories on computers, and then really the dawning of the internet age and of the chance to reach audiences that people in our roles before us could never have dreamed of. So now we find ourselves really awakening to the AI revolution. And I say that because you know better than anyone, AI is not new. But I think it is new in the lives and the mindsets of many, many more people than it ever was before. Even if they were interacting with algorithms and robots in all sorts of ways when they asked Alexa what the weather was, I think it was really only in this last year where many, many more people, both in their workplaces and in their private and personal lives, recognized what a transformational technology this was and started to wrestle with what it was going to mean for everything that they do.
Thank you for that history lesson. Thank you for the stories in the newsroom, for sharing with us the moment we're in with technology. I'd love to dive into what did that change look like for an organization, for leading an organization. It seems like trust is some component there, right, across the board, and building trust with the people using technology, with knowing that you need to have trust for your end users, the people who are consuming time. But how did that look like for you all?
So much to unpack there. I will say, for the people responsible for the P&L, new technologies also promise all kinds of new efficiencies and productivity and cost-saving measures. So that could be very exciting to them, even if it also introduced new competition. And for the storytellers, as exciting as it could be, it also could be terrifying if it's like, my job's going to disappear. And the first time that you saw ChatGPT turn a recipe for pound cake into a sonnet really had writers and creators' heads exploding. So I don't think that these are viewed as unalloyed goods or threats. I think everyone is having their own version of trying to figure out how much risk do these technologies represent to my happiness, my safety, my health, my well-being, and my job security. And for people who are in leadership roles, how do we adopt these technologies? And this gets to your trust question. How do we adopt these technologies in ways that are viewed as being thought through and ethical and valuable to our shared mission, as opposed to sort of a down and dirty shortcut to greater profitability or greater market access or any other kind of goal? And I do think that revolutions like this are a real test of leaders about how they engage with their employees, how they engage with their stakeholders, how they engage with their audiences, and how willing they are to expose their thinking and allow their thinking to evolve in real time. Because, boy, on something like this, no one has perfect visibility into how these tools are going to be incorporated into our work, even 6 months from now, much less, 2 or 3 or 5 years from now.
Can you dive more into that piece about the critical role of leaders now in communicating with everyone else in their organizations when new technologies come into the fold, whether they adopt it or not, whether they use it or not? It sounds like we have a lot to learn from history, but also a lot to learn. It's a new moment. It's a different kind of technology. So what are some thoughts for that?
I think it's often tempting for leaders to feel as though part of their responsibility as a leader is to behave as though they have perfect knowledge and perfect understanding, and that they are the best at all of the functions of everyone around them. And I think that's a fatal mindset, especially in a period of rapid change. While aggressive and transparent humility in the face of dramatic change, I think, is actually a trust builder. And what I mean by that is for leaders to say, this looks like a really interesting and powerful opportunity for us. I don't understand fully where it could take us. And so I'm going to share and be pretty clear about the process by which we're going to explore the opportunity, the risks, the ethical quandaries, the implementation of these, whether it's new tools or new processes and protocols and procedures, and not pretend that you go into any period of transformation, especially technological transformation, with perfect knowledge of how that's going to work and where you're going to end up. So for me, in a newsroom that was needing to dramatically change the way we did business, it was really important to signal to all of my reporters that this whole digital thing, this whole website thing, this whole video operation was not just sort of a tacked on add-on to our core mission of putting out a weekly magazine. It was really important that they understood, no, we are in the business of creating trusted, relevant, reliable content. That is the business we are in. And so in a sense, trust was our product, because every hour of every day we were publishing new stories and promoting new videos and producing content that we were distributing across platforms. So the continuous product was trustworthy information and content.
That's such a great reminder of, one, going back to what our purpose and product is, in your case, trusted information, and then bringing in this new thing, whatever it may be. In this case, it was communication technologies, now it's AI, but showing how it could really be integrated across and not just tacked on, and you still hold true to this core mission you have, right, of trusted information, and have it drive change that way. How did you see some of the strategies where you mentioned the fear of risk and concerns around this new state that folks were in? What are some strategies for going past that?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I think you build safety nets wherever you can, and you need to be pretty agile about that, which means having a good, risk radar. So, for every news organization, the transformation from having your job be to present a nightly newscast or a weekly magazine or a daily newspaper to being a 24/7 news operation is that every single editor-in-chief went to bed every night knowing that there was someone in their Brussels office or in their Hong Kong office who was going to be responsible for feeding the beast while you were asleep, and you really didn't want them to screw up. And so the kind of control that you had when we were all sort of working a normal workday and producing a product that we had total control over was very different than when all of a sudden the organization became bigger and more complex and more global and more multi-platform we need a totally different kind of radar array in order to make sure that we don't wake up in the morning finding there is some scandal that has erupted over something that happened in a part of the operation that went rogue, or that was insufficiently supervised, or who hadn't been brought into the culture of risk management. And so I think that, and again, obviously new technologies are a particular challenge, because even assessing what the risks are and what the trade-offs are with the obvious benefits that they bring is a whole kind of calculation that is going to be different depending on the organization and depending on the technology. One thing that seems to me particularly tricky about AI is that for most people who are not computer scientists, which means everyone who is not Kathy Pham, it feels like magic. Where again, it's it's turn the recipe into a sonnet. It is being able to interrogate this our robot friends, and have it respond in a way that feels very human. Even the way ChatGPT renders its answers feels like it's thinking,
right.
And which obviously is an intentional design feature. Yeah. But the reaction that rational people have is that I am interacting with an entity that I sort of know is not human and yet is designed by humans, and yet most humans don't understand entirely about how it works. And so there's a lot of magic. And the more room there is for magic, the more room there is for probably both exaggerating the harms and the rewards and opportunities. But certainly for being very careful about trusting it. It's harder to trust things that we don't understand. Even though most of us walk around with a smartphone in our hands, and I promise that the vast majority of us have no idea how it works. And if you had handed any of us a smartphone back in, 1995, it would have absolutely seemed magical. And so we all have had the experience that we are now incredibly reliant on and comfortable with technologies that we ourselves at an earlier stage of our lives would have been flabbergasted by. And so I feel like, this is likely to play out when it comes with AI tools that right now are can feel mind-blowingly magical, but that over time, with experimentation, with exposure, with the comfort level with them, even if we don't understand how they work any more than we understand how our smartphones work, but I can easily imagine over time that people will become much more willing to trust them, take them for granted, incorporate them into their workflow and into their personal work. But that's a process, and I don't expect us to start at that level of trust right out of the gate.
What do you think is needed in that process of going from a technology that perhaps a group of engineers, computer scientists develop over here? And there's maybe a layer of product managers who think about features and bring it to production. And there's this big gap of how do you get to value add and even seamless integration into our lives in ways that we don't even question it anymore, right? Whereas, like you said, in 1995, if we brought someone the iPhone, they're like, what is this? And now it's like, oh, it's just part of my life. What are some thoughts you have on going from the technology to the point where it's really useful just for human flourishing and human potential?
I think we're already seeing much greater interrogation of what are the values that are underlying the design of these tools. And what are they assuming and expecting in terms of the values and ethical scaffolding that underlies the creation of these tools, and what sorts of demands are they going to put on the companies that are building these tools in terms of ethical practice?
You mentioned a few things about the concerns around AI, also some of the potential language, maybe sometimes even I've seen hyperbolic language around what AI can do or what it can't do from all extremes. How do you think, from what you've seen and the folks you've talked to, how do you think we can have better informed decision-making around how we use AI in our personal lives and our professional lives when we're leading teams? What do you think can help us drive better decision-making?
That's a great question. And again, it's one where everyone is different. Every organization is going to be different. The atmosphere I'm working in now of a university, it's fascinating already seeing the range of responses in faculty about how do I think about incorporating AI tools into either my class preparation, my research. How do I instruct students about how they're allowed to use it? And I go back to transparency. My instruction to my students is I encourage you to use these tools. They're going to be part of your life. They're going to be part of your work. But you have to tell me how you're using them. And if in the final, if in the term paper that you turn in at the end of the semester, it is clear to me that the robots worked harder than you did, then your grade is going to reflect that. But having said that, there are so many ways in which these tools can help you take your work to a higher level. So just tell me how you incorporated it. That's a very different thing than when I hear from parents that their middle schoolers are no longer being given take-home writing assignments. And the parents, of course, are up in arms because it's really important, even if the robots are able to write a great essay about Hedda Gabler, it's still really important that my 14-year-old knows how to compose a well-structured, clearly written piece of writing, the same way, the arrival of calculators didn't mean that you no longer need to know what 7 times 6 is. And so I think there's such difference depending on the environment and what the actual mission is. And whatever our answers are now, they're likely to keep on evolving.
I'm thinking through the same thing as well with my students, where my general policy also is you're free to use these tools, whether it's something that's a large language model or generative AI, or just search or whatever tools out there. And I'm still navigating it, trying to figure out, these are your learning objectives. I hope you get there and you use those tools however you see fit, but you're right, and disclose them or non-disclose or figure out the right balance of that. But at the end of the day, we still want people who know how to write, who can craft a memo, in my case, a product requirements document, with the aid of the tools. And it seems like we're all figuring out across academia, our governments, our workplaces, that balance of how much tooling, how much enablement should we have?
But doesn't it raise the hard question to me is, what are some things that maybe we should stop teaching? And that is harrowing to people for whom teaching is their entire identity, and that the idea that something that they've been teaching for 10 or 20 or 30 years will no longer need to be taught. It's like, yes, we are not teaching horse and buggy repair. And I think that understandably that is very unnerving, but it's also incredibly exciting because presumably it frees up time and energy in the classroom and in our research work to, we don't have to teach that rather routine thing anymore, because the reason that we were teaching it is as a means to be able to do this higher level thing. Now we can go straight to that higher level thing. Or do you just teach that intermediate, I come back to writing, there's all kinds of writing that is pretty routine and not terribly rewarding or creative or, revelatory. Is it possible that we can outsource to our robot friends a lot of very routine writing functions so that our, time and intellect and creative energies can be devoted to a kind of writing that's much more rewarding and exciting and interesting to do in the first place?
So many parallels to what I see across the workplace. So what are, in your case, what are things we should stop teaching? What are some skills and companies we should just stop having? But then free up that time to do much more meaningful work. So maybe not copy and paste job descriptions over and over and over again, because there's a way to automate that. Now you can really focus on meaningful job descriptions, for example. And that's such a powerful way of thinking about that. What are just different ways of working completely? And that can be quite scary to rethink our organizations.
Well, and this goes back to the challenge to organizational leaders right now, which is your employees' trust in you would naturally reflect whether they think your first impulse is, great, I'm going to be able to fire all these people, versus, great, I'm going to be able to elevate, empower, retrain these people and deploy them in new ways that take advantage of their skills and understanding of our mission, and will end up potentially in a much more rewarding ability to contribute to the overall work of the mission. There will always be people who don't want to take that journey, and you don't have to expect that. But I think it will be natural for employees to wonder, is the first reflex of the organization, oh great, we can do the same things we've always done more efficiently with fewer people and save money? Or is the reflex of the organization going to be, we can do the same things we've always done and more and better and explore new things that are aligned with our mission, because we're going to liberate all of this talent and energy in our workforce to be deployed in new ways while the robots take care of things that were never that rewarding to begin with.
Let's pull on that thread and wrap up on the practical steps then for building that kind of trust in the environment with both leaders and employees.
It will not shock you to hear that I start and end with communication. And I say that knowing that it's hard. Like, it's much easier to keep a tight decision-making circle and communicate only as much as is absolutely necessary to the people to whom it's absolutely necessary need to know. At a time of rapid and disruptive change, I think it changes the imperatives around how you communicate, and getting into a different rhythm of including being able to communicate uncertainty. And we just lived through the incredible stakes of leaders not being able to successfully communicate uncertainty during COVID, where entirely understandably, epidemiologists, public health figures, there was a lot that they didn't know about a novel virus, and people were desperate for information. And it is very challenging to be able, especially in our information environment, to say, this is what we know right now and how we know it. This is what we suspect but have not yet confirmed, to sort of school us in the scientific method that we are testing our hypotheses as we go and communicate the limits of our knowledge and understanding. Communicating uncertainty is really difficult. But one thing I will say about trust is that it's a two-way transaction. And if leaders want people to trust them, people have to feel trusted. And so when public health leaders were worried about mask hoarding and that frontline workers would not have access to enough masks, and so wanted to discourage that and downplayed the need for masks in order to avoid hoarding, maybe that was a very rational, well-founded concern, but it signaled to people that those leaders did not trust them. And people can tell when you don't trust them. And so that is the test in leadership, is if it is important to you that your stakeholders, internal and external, trust you, then that has to be a two-way street.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing so much wisdom there on really communication and its power in building trust. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for joining me today in AI Horizons, covering everything from a history lesson to the newsroom, to communication, to trust, to academia, to thoughtful collaboration, to really understanding different sectors in the field when we go and build technologies for them. I've learned so much today, and I'm really grateful you were able to join us.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Kathy.
Thank you.